Rocket Riders of the 27th Century proudly brings to you a short story, The Reigns of Power, written by Michael Moreau, read for you by Mark Roddy. Planet Lothar, in the Canis Major Dwarf Galaxy. "Come in out of the weather," the man under the overhang shouted to the figure standing before him. "He's waiting for you." The figure, shielded from the downpour by a thick vinyl rain slicker worn over heavy battle armor, only nodded his helmeted head. The guard stepped aside and pressed his thumb into the panel of the wall that caused the large circular door behind him to roll open. Vanrie Kryll was trembling inside the armor, her breath a heavy continuous echo inside the newly acquired helmet that she wore. It still bore the scent of its previous owner, a combination of sweat and the musk of an outdoorsy smelly cologne. As she passed the guard, Vanrie tried her best to imitate the walk of the mercenary that had, until the day before, been wearing the armor suit. He'd been a small man with a noticeable limp, but regardless one with the reputation for brutality and combat effectiveness. Indeed, those were the reasons she had selected him. His notoriety granted him access to places she would ordinarily not be permitted, and his short stature meant that only a small amount of lift had to be inserted into her boots to compensate for the height difference. She kept her head down, tried to rein in her heavy breathing. Too much effort had been put into the plan to blow it now by giving herself away. The man at the door said nothing. He either didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, or simply didn't care. His sidearm was still holstered. Had she even approached the door in her regular clothing, his pistol would have been immediately drawn on her. "Good," she thought. The passage beyond the threshold was circular like the door and about 10 meters long. It appeared to have been carved straight out of the drab brownish rock of the mountain. The outer door closed behind her as she passed it, and she approached tall rectangular inner doors that were hewn from the deep ochre-colored lacquered wood. These too opened on their own as she reached them. The sight on the other side overwhelmed her. Through a large plate glass window she could see that the inside of the mountain had indeed been hollowed out just as rumored and to great effect. Before her was a cavern the scale of which dwarfed even the wildest stories she'd heard about the hidden city. The entire space was lit up and filled with buildings of every conceivable shape and size. The sky, for lack of a better term, around teemed with hovering trams and air cars. All of it glittered, constructed of the finest materials, and, unlike the outside world, was not caked in permanent layers of filth from decades of wildly alternating dust and rainstorms. "Bastards," she uttered to herself. She gawked for a moment, but managed to pull her gaze from the infuriating view. She turned left down the cavernous marble corridor and headed for the lifts that would, according to the now expired mercenary at least, take her up to Fenson Harus's office. Approaching them, she paused to remove her heavy slicker and place it into a nearby coat rack. She then pressed the button and entered the rightmost lift. The elevator, like everything else inside the mountain, was unnecessarily ornate. The buttons were hand-carved from some type of off-world ivory and inlaid into a panel of fine brass. Pressing the one marked penthouse, it illuminated with a soft, warm glow. The lift moved into action, and, after a period longer than she would have expected, it came to a stop and the doors opened. Before her was another long hall with a similar large wooden door at its end. Near it stood two men, each dressed in business suits which were a stark contrast from the government-issued coveralls worn by the guard outside. Again, Vanrie was mindful of her movements as she crossed the distance between them. It worked apparently, for the men said nothing as she advanced. Wearing a helmet had the advantage of allowing her eyes to wander without suspicion. She examined each of the guards closely. The telltale bump of a firearm was visible under the jackets of both men. Vanrie fully expected them to ask for weapons, and it was for that very reason she'd concealed the derringer in her brassiere. To her surprise, however, they simply waved her through. "Complacency," she thought. "Good." The privileges of wealth and power on display inside the mountain were unthinkable to someone like her who had spent their entire lives hungry and overworked. On the outside, no one trusted anyone else. Civilians were prohibited from owning firearms, but someone was always desperate enough to fashion a makeshift knife or powder thrower from some discarded farm implements so that they could steal a little more food. It was so common that folks didn't even hold a grudge over such transgressions anymore, All knew the desperation of hunger. Lothar was a mudhole full of hungry souls fighting over scraps and finally seeing the excess of the city dwellers for herself, knowing the suffering of the people was completely unnecessary, only further enraged Vanrie. It steeled her resolve over what she knew she had to do. The office just inside heavy timber doors was dimly lit by a multitude of diminutive antique desk and floor lamps. The light from them was warmer than any type of electric lamp she'd seen before, again likely from some long outdated technology employed solely for the aesthetics. Under her feet ran fine carpeting from wall to wall, accentuated with a large intricately woven rug that butted up against a sturdy wooden desk. Behind it sat an overstuffed leather chair that faced away from the door, but began to spin around as she entered. "Creosote Jarrett!" roared the corpulent planetary magistrate as he rose from his seat and rounded the desk to greet who he thought was his mercenary friend. Vanrie had seen his face before, of course, during his yearly public address, which was beamed to screens in every province and which were mandatory viewing for every Lotharian. He was human, mostly, possibly with a touch of Sperillian ancestry, and in person his jowls and pronounced gut were even more evident than in the fuzzy vidwaves. He was clad in a suit of the finest off-world materials and not the faded, dull green worker's tunic that they had always dressed him in for his public appearances. As he waddled toward her, his gut, offensive simply for its existence, strained at the fabric of his vest. "I have a task for you, Creosote," the fat little man said, clearly elated. Vanrie froze, trying to remember the mannerisms of the mercenary whose armor she now wore. She had started them carefully upon his many visits to the tavern where she had been lucky enough to work. With practiced precision, she nodded the helmet as if asking for him to continue. "I think you'll like this one," the magistrate smiled, pausing momentarily to turn and grab a flagon of wine and 2 glasses from his desk. "It's down near the southern tip of the Oralai Range, a large village called Anthuth." The man handed Vanrie a glass. She took it from him, and he began to fill it as he continued. "I need you to deal with some rabble that has been defying my security forces for the last few weeks. Miners that are on a hunger strike, if you can imagine that." He burst into uproarious laughter. It took every bit of self-control she had for Vanrie not to smash her glass against his skull and cut his throat right then and there. She gritted her teeth, but her restraint held. Instead, she managed a small, deep chuckle. "Do you know what I told Kren?" he asked, referring to some person whom she was not familiar with. Vanrie shook her head. "I told her we should just starve the buggers out. Ship in more from the northern provinces. But you know how she's always up in arms about something. Such a liberal, that Kren." Vanrie felt her right hand tense against the grip of her proton blaster. Fenson Harus tossed back the contents of his glass and swallowed audibly. "But I told her we'd compromise like always." He'd put his hand on the mercenary's left pauldron. "I told her that Creosote will go down there and off a few of the miscreants in a gruesome but public fashion. That should prevent us from having to do any large-scale culling." Again, Vanrie nodded and mimicked a chuckle, but Harus paused, and she saw suspicion in his eyes. "Why, Creosote? You don't intend to drink your wine?" he asked in an accusatory tone. She looked down at the glass in her hand. It was trembling, but only just. "Ah, hell," she thought. She reached up with her free hand and unfastened the helmet from her collar, and removing it ever so slowly, saw the shock on Fenson Harus' face as her long reddish-brown hair tumbled down and framed her feminine, yet hard-edged, face. "Who the hell are you?" he quite literally spat. She caught his arm as he dropped his glass and tried to reach back for the button on his desk that would summon the guards. Emptying her glass onto the ornate woven rug while staring him dead in the eye, she tossed it aside and pulled a knife which she pressed against his throat. "What do you want?" he pleaded. "Justice for the people of Lindal, and by your hand no less." What? He babbled, clearly terrified out of his wits. Vanrie yanked him toward her and she leaned over him menacingly. "While we all suffer and die out there, you live like kings inside this mountain." We... he stammered, trying to find the words he'd memorized. We are dedicated public servants who have spent our entire lives trying to keep barely habitable world alive. She pressed the knife into his flesh. A small drop of blood trickled down the blade. Please, he exclaimed. I'll scream. And with that, she removed a device from her belt and tossed it over to the carpet near the door. Lights on it lit up and it began to emit a low thrumming sound. That's a sonic dampener. Go ahead and scream. They won't hear a thing. She could see the fear in him rise, felt him tremble. There was the sound of liquid dropping onto the rug, and she realized that he had lost control of his bladder. Vanrie lost her temper and tossed him back onto the desk. You're disgusting, she spat. And I'm not referring to you pissing yourself like a frightened child. Please don't kill me, he cried. She walked around to the backside of the desk before violently seizing the fat magistrate under his chin. With her other hand, she again put the knife to his throat. I know about the rain, she said quietly into his ear. What? His eyes widened with fear. She reached into a pouch on her belt and produced a small plastic vial of clear liquid, which she then held over his face. I know what you did, she yelled, finally losing her temper. You tainted the very rain that falls from our sky, you fat sack of Tark snipe. No, I swear it! We did no such thing! Without warning, she crushed the vial and let its contents leak into his open mouth. He spat violently and tried to sit up. She allowed it. Clamoring for his handkerchief, he quickly brought it to his mouth and he began to spit into it. Don't bother, Vanrie grinned. What was in that vial? She continued. The poison you rained down on this entire planet is absorbed immediately upon contact. But you know that already, don't you? He kept trying to spit as she spoke. Stimulants to keep us from being tired, she shouted. Painkillers to keep us working, hypnotics to keep us confused, heavy metals to taint our fields and keep us dependent on you for food. Vanrie cocked back and kicked the man in the chest with everything she had. He flailed back onto the desk before rolling off onto the floor. How do you know this? He pleaded as she rounded the desk. You'd be surprised how loose the lips your hired guns get when they've had their fill of drink. Fenson didn't speak for several moments. He appeared to be looking for the words that would exonerate him. When he did speak, it was through tears. What are you going to do with me? Are you going to kill me? No, she assured him. No, I'm not going to kill you. Forcing a smile. Then what? Vanrie crouched down next to him. She unholstered her pistol and pressed it into his forehead. You said... Shut up, she shouted before slapping him hard against the side of his face with her gun. He did as he was told, but continued to sob. Now be very quiet and listen to me. The terrified magistrate shook his head in acknowledgement, his heavy jowls flapping. I'm going to target that mass driver you've got in orbit. The one used during the uprising a half-century ago to wipe out entire villages. And I'm going to reduce this mountain to a smoldering pile of rocks. You said you wouldn't kill me, he protested. Oh, you're coming with me. Once I blast your two goons outside, nobody else will try to get in our way. Not with my gun to your head. Are you gonna ransom me? That was it, right there. He didn't even care about this city under the mountain or the tens of thousands of people in it. He cared only about his own miserable hide. She had no plans of murdering an entire city full of people, though they were collaborators and would have deserved any reprisal they'd gotten. No, she would use the terminal on his desk to order an emergency evacuation of the mountain, and then set a short delay on the orbital weapon. It would be just enough time to get everyone out, and in the confusion, she and her hostage would slip aboard his personal rocket and use it to escape. Yes, something like that, was her only response to his self-serving query. An hour later, aboard the interstellar rocket repulsively named Mogul's Prize, Vanrie Kryll stared intently at the cockpit displays as fire rained down on the mountain city below. Having spent her entire life in the hellish conditions imposed upon her and her people, she felt little sorrow for its displaced citizens. Citizens who would soon find themselves in the ostracized underclass of Lothar. They had been complicit in the subjugation and literal poisoning of a planet. She thought about how a more weak-willed individual than herself might have done things quite differently. It would have been a trivial matter to level the mountain city with everyone still inside it. But she would already have to live with the thought that surely not every single individual made it out during the evacuation. Someone else might have also seized the opportunity to install themselves as the new planetary magistrate. After all, she had control of the mass driver, so it was not as if anyone could oppose her. Vanrie was no tyrant, though. She would use the weapons of the Mogul's prize to destroy the orbital weapon after it slagged the rain generators. It would then ferry her to deliver Fenson Harus to the Federated World's justice system, along with the ample proof of his crimes. He, and likely some of his people, would pay for the atrocities they had committed. She wanted to see that it was done fairly, a luxury the magistrate's government had never afforded ordinary Lotharians. It was for those very reasons that Vanrie, the mercenary-turned-native Generate Tosk, had selected her for the special training some 3 years previous. Great care had been taken to select someone who would not turn around and themselves become a despot. Truth be told, it was not as if the thought had not crossed Vanrie's mind. She was, after all, human, and there is still something of a green-eyed monster in all of us. Her motives, however, despite being truly believing in the cause of liberating her people, were not as entirely altruistic as her mentor had believed. Spending a lifetime feeling weak and powerless, Vanrie had seen the mission as more than salvation for her people. She'd also seen it as an opportunity to leave Lothar behind, and with it, hopefully the memories of an existence that was too painful to want to remember. No, there had never been any real risk of her seeking the reins of power for herself. Her destiny was among the stars. The end.